grey shadow of dawn crept across the horizon. The city had not fully awakened, yet the darkness clung to the alleys like mist that refused to fade. Neng took a deep breath. The scent of old rain lingered in the air, mixed with memories he wished he could leave behind but couldn't. His footsteps echoed on the damp pavement, a steady rhythm in the silence, like a ghost of the past that refused to let go. He had escaped, but the scars remained. Not just on his body, but deeper, etched into his soul. Yet his story did not end here, because this was not the conclusion, but the beginning, because silence can never bury the truth forever. Night draped the small apartment in shadows, the only light coming from the laptop screen's cold glow. Neng Thao sat hunched over, eyes fixed on the email before him. The subject line shimmered like a beacon in the dark: exclusive opportunity, high-paying media job. His heart pounded. A golden chance. A way out. Life as a struggling YouTuber in Laos wasn't easy, barely scraping by, chasing views that never came, wondering if his dreams were worth the fight. But this could change everything. The cursor hovered over reply. One click. A new beginning. Or a trap. The call. Golden morning light bathes the quiet village. Neng stands at the gate, backpack slung over his shoulder. His mother grips his hands tightly, her eyes filled with silent worry. His younger sibling clutches his sleeve, unwilling to let go. Neng smiles, hope flickering in his gaze. A deep breath. A wave. He steps away. The village fades behind him, blurred by distance and time. On the bus, sunlight spills through the window, painting his face in gold. His fingers tighten around a worn-out map, dreams unfolding with every mile. The city skyline rises ahead. His journey begins. The van rattled along the highway, its dim interior thick with quiet tension. The air smelled of old fabric and nervous sweat, the kind that clung to a bloke when the future was too close to touch but still just out of reach. Other recruits sat hunched in the shadows, faces flickering in and out of the light as street lamps passed overhead. A bloke near the window tapped his knee, his breath fogging up the glass. Someone else clenched their hands, knuckles white. No one spoke. Neng exhaled slow, steady. Outside, the world blurred. Dark paddocks, distant city lights, a road stretching on like a promise. No turnin' back now. The van jolted over a pothole, its worn tires crunching against the gravel. The air inside was thick, sweat, dust, the weight of unsaid words. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. Outside, floodlights burned through the night, slicing shadows across the checkpoint. Heavily armed guards stood like statues, rifles slung across their chests, eyes sharp and unreadable. A red and white boom gate blocked the road ahead, paint chipped from years of passing ghosts. The driver killed the engine. Silence. A single knock on the window. Neng swallowed hard. The border was just a line on a map. But crossing it? That was something else entirely. The room was stark, white walls, white ceiling, the kind of emptiness that swallowed sound. The air smelled of disinfectant and something colder, something unseen. Neng sat rigid, fists curled on his knees. His passport, his phone, gone. Stripped of name, of voice, of escape, across from him, a man loomed, broad-shouldered, shadowed in the fluorescent glare. His voice was low, steady, the kind that left no room for hope. You are here now. No turning back. The words settled like iron in Neng's gut. The door behind him stayed shut. The world outside might as well have vanished. A day later, rows of young men and women sat hunched over computer monitors, their faces pale in the flickering glow. The air was thick, stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and the quiet hum of forced labor. Neng's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Armed men paced behind them, boots scuffing against the floor. A mistyped word could bring a slap, a mistake could bring worse. He swallowed hard. A week later, the messages came easier now. The lies are smoother. A name flashed on his screen, another victim. His stomach clenched, but his hands kept moving. Survival wasn't a choice. It was the only option. A day later, the fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the stark, grey walls. The air hung heavy, thick with sweat, fear, and the quiet dread of those who had learned not to speak. Ning sat frozen, his knuckles white against the edge of his chair. His breath came shallow, uneven. Across the room, a man, weak, hollow-eyed, was being dragged away, his feet barely lifting off the floor. He didn't fight. No one ever did. A week later, the routine was straightforward now. Work. Obey. Survive. The guards watched, their eyes unreadable. The walls closed in, the silence pressing against his ribs, the door slammed shut. Another day lost. Another tomorrow is uncertain. A day later, the ring light burned bright, too bright. It cast sharp halos in his eyes, reflecting off the cold lens aimed at his face. The camera rolled. A guard stood just beyond the frame, arms crossed, watching. Always watching, Ning swallowed. His pulse pounded in his throat. The words were scripted, forced through clenched teeth, but his eyes told the truth. Fear flickered behind the false smile, trapped beneath the weight of unseen threats. A week later, another recording. Another lie. His voice steadier now, his hands still. The fear remained, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment he could finally escape. A night later, the dormitory was stifling, thick with the scent of unwashed clothes and restless fear. The only light came from a distant hallway, spilling faintly through the gaps in the door. Shadows danced along the walls as footsteps passed, slow, heavy. Listening, Ning leaned in, his voice barely a breath. Shift changes at dawn. One guard at the back exit. The others nodded, their eyes hollow but burning with the same quiet desperation. Outside, a shadow stretched beneath the door. The group fell silent, hearts hammering as the handle rattled, just once. A long pause. Then footsteps retreating into the night. Tomorrow, they would try. A night later, the locker door creaked, a sound too loud in the suffocating silence. Ning's breath hitched as he slipped his trembling fingers inside, feeling through the clutter until, there. Cold plastic. A stolen SIM card, small but holding the weight of a lifeline. Close up, his hands shook, slick with sweat. His pulse thundered in his ears. One mistake, one wrong move, and it was over. A shadow shifted outside. Footsteps. He swallowed hard, shoving the locker shut just as the doorknob twisted, the SIM pressed into his palm like a promise. If he played this right, there was still a way out. A day later, bright lights. Fake smiles. The camera streamed live, beaming scripted excitement to faceless viewers. Ning sat stiffly, the cards in his hand meaningless, his voice an empty echo of rehearsed lines. His pulse pounded. He couldn't risk hesitation. As he reached for a chip, his fingers curled, just for a second, forming a silent signal. A plea. A warning. Close up, his eyes flickered with fear, with hope. Would someone notice? Would anyone understand? A guard shifted off screen. Ning's breath caught. The moment had passed. He forced a smile, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Now, all he could do was wait. A week later, the office was lavish, a mahogany desk, gold accents, and the stale scent of expensive cigars. Across from Ning sat the boss, a man draped in quiet menace, his eyes sharp, his smile sharper. Ning nodded, feigning respect, masking the storm beneath his skin. He listened, committing every detail to memory, the offshore accounts, the encrypted messages, the names whispered like secrets. Close up, his fingers curled under the table, pressing into his palm to steady his nerves. One wrong word, one flicker of doubt, and it was over. The boss leaned in, eyes narrowing. Loyalty, mate. That's all that matters here. Ning forced a grin. Of course. The game had begun. A night later, the compound plunged into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was silence, then shouts, the stomp of boots, the crackle of radios. Red emergency lights flickered, painting the walls in sharp, jagged shadows. Ning moved like a ghost through the chaos, his silhouette slipping between crates past panicked guards barking orders. His breath was shallow and controlled. There were no second chances, no mistakes. A flashlight beam swept past, too close. He pressed himself into the shadows, heart hammering. The exit was near. Freedom was near. One deep breath. Then he ran. A night later, rain pelted the pavement, turning the alley into a slick, glistening trap. Neng's breath came fast, his pulse louder than the wailing sirens behind them. Footsteps crashed through puddles, his, theirs, and the ones hunting them. His clothes clung to his skin, drenched and heavy, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when freedom was just beyond the next corner. A glance back, faces tight with terror, jaws set with determination. No words were needed. They had to keep running. A flashlight beam slashed through the rain. Voices shouted. Neng gritted his teeth, lungs burning, faster. Days later, the room was quiet, the only light coming from the laptop screen's faint glow. Neng sat motionless, shoulders heavy, breath slow. His reflection stared back, eyes sunken, haunted, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't leave behind. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Messages, confessions, warnings, so much to say, but where to start? Who would believe him? Outside, the city moved on, unaware. But the truth remained on the screen, in his own tired gaze. He had escaped. But was he free? A week later, Neng sat still, the laptop screen casting a cold glow across his face. His hands hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The title stared back at him on the screen, I survived the Mayawati scam factories. The cursor blinked, waiting, daring him to take the final step. He exhaled. The world needed to know. The voices of the lost and the trapped needed to be heard. With a steady breath, he clicked upload. No more silence. Days later, the wall stretched before him, covered in faces, young, old, hopeful, afraid. Each one frozen in time, marked with a single word, missing. Neng's fingers trembled as they brushed over a photo. A familiar face. Someone he had whispered plans with in the dark and sworn wouldn't be forgotten. His throat tightened. He had made it out. But they were still there. The rain pattered against the window. Outside, life moved on. Inside, Neng stood still. He wasn't done yet. That night, the street was quiet and empty except for the black SUV idling outside. Its headlights were off, and the engine humming low, almost a whisper. Neng stood by the window, barely breathing. His fingers curled against the curtain, pulling it back just enough to see. Inside the SUV, a shadow sat still, watching. Waiting, his stomach twisted. They had found him, the laptop on his desk was still open, the words of his story glowing in the dark. His truth was out, but so were they. Families gathered in quiet villages and cramped city apartments, eyes locked on the screen. The glow of Neng's video flickered across their faces, Hmong, Lao, Cambodian, united by the same fear and rage. A mother clutched a faded photo. A father's hands curled into fists. A sister wiped silent tears. They listened to his words, to the horrors their loved ones might still be facing. The silence broke. Murmurs turned to anger, grief turned to action. Calls were made. Names were